We're continuing with Chapter 1, Section 1.2 on quadratic equations and solving quadratic equations in 4 methods. The last video we looked at solving by factoring. In this video we're going to look at the square root method first here. Example 2. Solve a quadratic equation using the square root method. The square root method has us have the variables being squared, usually it's x, but it could be something else, on the left side, and everything else on the right side, and then we take the square root. So in this case, we need to get the squared part by itself by adding 7 to both sides. And the square root method then says take the square root of both sides to find your solutions. So we take the square root of x squared, but the square root of 7 will get positive or negative square root of 7, because negative 7 squared and negative square root of 7 squared is the same as the positive square root of 7 squared. Okay, so x equals plus or minus the square root of 7. So if this would simplify, this radical, we should simplify it. If there was a square root of 8, that would simplify, right, to 2 square roots of 2. But it doesn't, so our solutions, you can write it like that, plus or minus square root of 7, or the square root of 7 comma negative square root of 7. I think either way is fine, or just once with the plus or minus in front. You should be able to plug that in and check, and it will check. Okay, so here our squared part is in the parentheses. So to get this by itself, we'll add 9 to both sides. And now use the square root method. Take the square root of both sides. The square root of x minus 4 squared is equal to plus or minus. Remember, these are quadratics. So we're really looking for 2 solutions if they're, if at all possible. There could be one double root, but there's always the possibility of no solution, no real number. But in this case, we're looking for 2. That should help us remember plus or minus. So when we take the square root of x minus 4 squared, we just get x minus 4, just like the square root of x squared is x. But here we get plus or minus 3. So those are 2 equations now. We have x minus 4 equals positive 3, and x minus 4 equals negative 3. We have to solve both of those. Add 4 to both sides, x is 7. Add 4 to both sides, x is 1. Solution set 7, 1 or 1, 7. You can plug that back in and check. That's the square root method. These are the 2 basic formats. You either end up with something like this, an x in a parentheses with a squared on it, or just by itself. So in order to use the square root method, we have to have our equation written in one of these 2 forms that we've got it to here. To get a quadratic equation in one of these forms, we can use the method of complete the square. We saw this in R5, completing the square. And what happened, we found the number we needed to add so that when we factored, we got a binomial squared. So that's what this is saying. We can try to achieve that format, so then we can just use the square root method. Okay, so x squared plus 6x plus 5 equals 0. Now, when we did complete the square at the end of R5, it wasn't an equation. We were just finding the number to add. So now we need to move that 5 to the other side, because we need to figure out the number to add to this trinomial to make it a perfect square trinomial. So, in other words, I'm going to add, I like to make blanks for myself. What am I adding here? And of course I have to add it on both sides to keep my equation balanced. Well, do you remember what it was? We were adding, I'm going to write it under my blank, 1/2 of b squared. That's what goes on both sides. Okay, so b in this trinomial is what? 6. Yes, half of 6, 3. 3 squared, 9. So 9 must be what I'm adding to both sides. Okay, now I know this factors to a perfect square trinomial. That was the whole point. And if you remember, this was always half of b. I don't even have to think x plus 3. Whatever before it got squared, half of b. If that had been negative, it'd be negative 3. It's positive, it's positive 3. There's my half of b. If I FOIL x plus 3 times x plus 3, this is what I'll get. Okay, what do we have over here? -5 plus 9, or 4. Now we have this same format. Square root method. Square root of x plus 3 squared equals plus or minus the square root of 4. So x plus 3 equals plus or minus 2. So x plus 3 equals positive 2, or x plus 3 equals negative 2. Subtract 3, x equals -1. Subtract 3, x equals -5. Now this one came out to two pretty integers. This was a factorable equation. It would have been much quicker to do that way, but for our first time through, I wanted to show some nice numbers, how nicely that comes out. But that wouldn't have been the easiest way to do that problem, but it's a lot easier to complete the square with nice easy numbers. When we look at B, this one's a little trickier. For 1, we're not going to be able to get it in this format with that 4 in front of the x squared. I need it to look like this, just x plus or minus something parentheses squared. And with the 4 in front, that ain't going to work. So the first thing I have to do is make sure that x squared has a coefficient of 1. Okay, so I'm going to make a note. X squared must have a coefficient of 1 to do this method of completing the square. How am I going to do that? Well, we'll divide every term in this equation by 4, because that will make the x squared have a coefficient of 1. That cancels. There's my x squared. 2/4 x, I'm going to write that as 1/2 x minus 3/4, and of course 0 divided by 4 is just 0. Okay, next thing we have to do, I've got to get this constant out of my way, because I'm going to add the correct number to make this a perfect square trinomial. X squared minus 1/2 x plus blank equals 3/4 plus blank. All right, we can still do this. You can use your calculator. Half of b squared goes here. b is -1/2. Half of -1/2 is -1/4. And squaring -1/4, you square the -1, you get 1. You square the 4, you get 16. Okay, so remember, this is going to factor to x, there's a minus, minus half of b before it got squared. And it was the 1/4, -1/4, right? It's just the half of b that goes there. Over here, I've got to add 3/4 and 1/16. Use your fraction key on your calculator, but this is just 12/16 and 1/16, so it's 13/16. Square root method. X minus 1/4 squared equals plus or minus the square root of 13/16. And recall, we can break these square roots up. I can take the square root of the numerator and separate that out from the square root of the denominator. So I have x minus 1/4 equals plus or minus. 13 is not a perfect square and it cannot be simplified, but 16 is. So I'm going to take the square root of 16 and get 4. Okay, we're not done yet. Now I need to add 1/4 to both sides. So I'm going to put it in the front. 1/4 plus or minus the square root of 13/4. These are my two solutions. Now I can't, because that's irrational. I do not want decimals. I'm going to leave that as an accurate or a number, because if I take square roots, then I'm going to, with that of 13, I'll have to round and it won't be accurate anymore. So what I'll do is just combine them all over this common denominator. I have 1 plus or minus the square root of 13/4. I can put that in the brackets, or I can put 1 plus the square root of 13/4, comma, 1 minus the square root of 13/4. Two solutions. Not as pretty. This one we could not have factored. We didn't get integers.